Hello, house built on love. It's so good to see all of you, and welcome to those of you out there in Zoom and YouTube land. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Reverend Robin Volker, and happy to be back at Unity of Gainesville. All right, I thought today we'd talk about Jesus a little. Is that all right? Yeah, okay. Lack of communication technology probably made it significantly more difficult back in those days. Can y'all hear me okay? Am I too loud? All right, just right? Okay. Now imagine that Jesus is speaking on the hillside outside of Capernaum, but he doesn't have the benefit of amplified sound. And there are thousands of people, right? So do you think those in the back heard the same thing that those in the front heard? Probably not. You know, there was a spoof about that in the film Monty Python's Life of Brian, where one listener on the way back peripheral said, "Oh, I think he said, 'Blessed are the cheesemakers.'" Wisconsin, yay! So we're going to practice what that was like a little bit. And for those of you who are with us on Zoom, you can just type these responses into the chat. So Jesus said that God is a God of love. So turn to behind you and repeat that like they would have done 2,000 years ago. God is a God of love. God is your loving Father. And God's greatest wish for you, God's greatest desire for you is joy and happiness. Now, hopefully, those of you on the back row still got the gist of what that was all about. When Jesus was delivering this great sermon, which is talked about in Matthew, he told us some really fundamental stuff. Basically, this message, which we know as the Sermon on the Mount, is really telling you Jesus' theology. That's really, if you want to know what Jesus was teaching, go read the Sermon on the Mount. He had told us in this long sermon, it was pretty long, in this long sermon, he talked about the Beatitudes, and there he's talking about the character that we want to take on as God's children. And he went on and he provided 6 illustrations of how that character can be applied. He talked about true spiritual worship and how that character is expressed. Today, I want to specifically talk about 2 alternatives that he gave us of how that character is established for us as followers of his teachings and as children of God. Jesus taught that day, he was teaching, if you hear my words, you will be like the wise man who built his house on rock. And the rains descended and the winds blew and beat upon that house, but yet it did not fall because it had a foundation on the rock. But anyone who hears my words and doesn't put them into action is like the foolish man who builds his house on sand. And the rains come down and the streams rise up and the winds blow and beat against that house. and it will fall with a great crash. Now, I imagine that Jesus knew a little bit about building. He was the son of a carpenter. He was the oldest son of a carpenter. So we can assume that he went with Joseph to build things, and that he was probably, at first, he was the carrier and the fetcher, right? And as they would go and build things together, and probably other builders would come to build bigger stuff together, they had to learn the basic principles of how to build. And Jesus learned that too. And the very first law of building is to make sure that you build on solid ground. Now, was Jesus telling us how to build a house? What was he telling us? Type it in the chat if you know. What was he building? What was he telling us? How to build our lives. How to build our lives. So listen up. This is important. If what we said in the beginning, that God's deepest desire for us is to have a happy and joyful life, then this is the recipe for how to have that happy and joyful life. The wise person is going to build that life on a strong foundation. And the wise person is going to know what that foundation is made out of. Whereas the foolish person is not going to listen to the laws of principle, the laws of the universe. And therefore, that life is not going to be happy and joyful. Now, there are major differences between building on rock and building on sand. If we build on sand, things get a little shaky, and they can start to wobble, and they can even fall down. So what are some of the things in your life that might possibly at times be built on sand? What about your job? Now, a lot of you are retired, but think back to the days when you were working. Was it secure? Did you have a firm foundation? Were there times that you didn't know what was going to happen next? Did you ever worry about what was coming down the pike with your job? Your job can be shaky. It can be built on ground. A few years ago, Rick had been with a company for 19 years. And then all out of the blue, they sold that division that he was the sales director for, and they sold Rick in the package. Talk about a shaky time. It was shaky, yeah. And what about, we think we have friends. Now, we can have friends that we feel like we have for life. But then there's also friends that if you say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing or don't return that text or email or phone call or like or love what they posted on Facebook, they're mad for days or weeks or months. Friends can get shaky. And then some of us have experienced marriages that got shaky. And what about medicine and doctors? All doctors didn't make A's, did they? Every time I go to a doctor, I pray that my doctor, didn't just skirt by the skin of their teeth, didn't collapse some important course that I'm going to be asking questions about. What about government? Government can get shaky, can't it? Our elected officials and the process of putting them in office and the result of peace in the world, that whole concept can get shaky when we listen to what's happening all around us. And what about our money and our investments? Is your 401k the same as it was before COVID? And the stock market, heck, even the weather can get shaky. Meteorologists are the only people that can be wrong 95% of the time and keep their jobs. So many things in our lives are in constant change. So no wonder we feel like that we're building on shaky ground. When Jesus spoke in this parable about the rains descending, that is symbolic of those pressures in our lives that just push us down. So just think about what are the pressures in your life? You know, that's overwhelm. When you've got too much on your plate, when you can't answer all of the demands that are put upon you. That's the rains descending in your life. And the winds that are blowing all around are symbolic of those pressures that are just pushing in from the outside in your life. What might that be? Things that are just pushing in on you. You know, all those things that we just talked about that we can't control, the government, the stock market, our investments, the interest rate. Those are things that are pushing in on us. And then the floods come and the waters rise up. And that's symbolic of those pressures that just want to pull us under. And that may be your family. That may be, worrying about those people that you love, that you can't do anything about what's happening in their lives, but you care about them and love them so much that you just can't go to sleep at night. So when we talk about the storms of life, we're talking about real stuff. The real stuff that when you walk out this door, you're living in it today, right now, this minute. But Jesus told us to build on the rock and that God is rock. Well, that sounds great, but exactly what does that mean and how do we apply it? I turned to metaphysician Emmett Fox for some good, old-fashioned, new thought, metaphysical advice about how to build on the rock. Emmett Fox taught that there are 7 basic aspects to the nature of God. And this is how we build on a strong foundation. First, there is life. God does not just give us life, God is life. So those of you who have health challenges in your life, just take this moment and breathe that in. God is life. God is life that moves in and through you and whatever you have going on in your life right now. And how do we know that we are expressing and tapped in and tuned in to that God is life, part of the rock? When our life feels expansive, when we have joy in our lives, no matter what is going on, if we can tap into that core that feels expansive, then we know we're standing on the rock of life. As opposed to feeling fear and restriction and wanting to pull in and not be open and moving outward. Emmett Fox said, joy and happiness always have an expansive effect. Fear has a contracting and paralyzing effect. So we know we're building on the rock of life when we feel like living. Basically, when we feel like being alive, we know we're tapped in to that rock of life. The second aspect of God that Fox talks about is God as truth. Now, I'm talking about truth with a capital T. How do you know the difference between God as truth and your truth? Here's the simple, my simple definition of that. Truth with a capital T is true no matter where you are in space and time. How many of you have ever lived anywhere besides here? Yeah. So I've lived in various parts of Georgia, Alabama, Texas, and Ohio. Was I a child of God in all those places? When you lived someplace else, in Michigan and Wisconsin and all those other places that you've lived, were you a child of God when you lived in Maine? Yeah, that's a truth. You are a child of God no matter where you are. No matter whether you go to the furthest reaches of space or the deepest depths of the ocean, you're a child of God. That's not going to change. So truth is that foundational rock that is true no matter what. It is with you always. And you have a connection to that truth through prayer and meditation. You can tap into that truth and remember that truth is that the truth with a capital T is stronger and more true than the little t truth in your checkbook or the little t truth on your doctor's diagnosis sheet or the little t truth of whatever the challenge is that you're up against. God is love. Now, God is not just loving, but God is love itself. Love itself. Emmett Fox called love the golden gate of paradise. Fox taught that it is through understanding love, and I don't mean this emotional love, I love you thing. I mean a deep understanding of what love is, absent of all fear. Yeah, that's a lot, isn't it? An understanding of what love is, absent of all fear. What would you do and say and be if there was no fear in your life? That's a big question. And Fox says that this is the most important thing and that we should meditate on this every day. Because meditating on love casts out fear. And love is absolutely invincible. It is the strongest thing that we have any awareness of. God is intelligence. God is omniscient. I love that word. Who can spell it? Omniscience. Omniscience. God is that creative harmony that is the mind behind all things. And I love that aspect of God. I love to teach about that aspect of God because I discovered many years ago that if I had to depend upon my own brain power, I was in big doo-doo because I just couldn't figure it all out. Well, when you're confronted with something that is more difficult than what you can comprehend and figure out, turn to the aspect of God that is intelligence. Because you can tap in to that great mind of God through the power of your mind. Through the power of meditation and prayer, you can tap in and plug in so that you know what you need to know when you need to know it. It's a great affirmation to live by. I know what I need to know when I need to know it. You might not know what you need to know when you walk out the door, but when you show up wherever you're going to know what you need to know. When you go for a medical treatment or a medical procedure, pray that your medical team is tapped into the intelligence of the mind of God. They're not relying on just what they can remember from their education, but they are tapped in to something that is smarter and stronger and knows what they need to do in that moment. Number 5, God is soul. Not only is our rock all these things that can be abstract and we could talk about them in a whole series, but God is also individualized, personal to you. That is the aspect of God that is soul. In unity, we call it the Christ within. When we call on that Christ within, we're calling on the aspect of God that is personal to us. The famous unity minister Eric Butterworth quoted St. Augustine in his book, Celebrate Yourself. He said, God is a circle whose center is everywhere and circumference is nowhere. Let me say that again. It's a famous line. God is a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. So just close your eyes and think about you as the center of God energy. You as the center of God energy. Now, not in an ego way, but in a transcendent way, because the person seated beside you is the center of God energy too. And you, and you, and you, and you. And open your eyes and think about all life everywhere. And just imagine that each life energy is the center of God. Wow. How cool is that? And even though every point is the center of God energy, there is no circumference. There is no end. There's no outer limit. It goes forever. Is that cool or what? That's God as soul. God is spirit. So we've talked about God is life, God is truth, God is love, God is intelligence, and God is soul, but God is also spirit. It is that energy that is immortal, cannot be damaged, cannot be hurt, cannot die, cannot end. So we go from feeling this intimacy of God as soul at the point where we are to trying to open our minds to the expansiveness of spirit. It can never deteriorate. It cannot grow old. It cannot be tired. It does not know mistake or sin or condemnation or resentment or disappointment. It doesn't know that. It's not in its makeup to be able to be any of that. This is a deep thought. And can you see that building on the rock of God as spirit gives you a strength that defies everything negative in your life? And perhaps the least understood aspect of God is God as principle. God is the law of the universe. The law of the multiverses as we know them now. There's not just one universe, but all that we know is replicated beyond what we can even measure. And all things must fall under this law of God as principle. Nothing can exist outside of that. And when we put our faith and trust in this rock, we're anchoring into a permanence, a stability that expands beyond our imagination. God as principle is what gives prayer power. For when we pray affirming the principle that God is, then what is true for me is true in your life, and it's true in your life, and it's true in your life. And when we pray for someone else, we're calling forth that principle to be demonstrated for that person. And that's how it works. All right, did you get all 7 of them? God is life. Say it with me. God is life, truth, love, intelligence, soul, spirit, principle. Life, truth, love, intelligence, soul, spirit, principle. With such a firm foundation. The winds and storms of our lives, which they'll come. There's no one in this room who has not had winds and storms in their lives. And you will have winds and storms before you breathe your last breath. But when you build on this foundation, then you know that you're building a life on the rock. And you're building the life to have that beauty and joy that is your divine birthright, to have it come forth. There's a divine relationship between you and your Creator. And it's one thing to understand this stuff intellectually, it's another to put it into practice. A young minister was driving through the countryside and he saw this farmer tilling this field. And it was a beautiful field. And the young minister stopped and got out of his car and walked up to the fence line and he said, "Hey, sir, you have a beautiful property. You and God have done magnificent things with this." And the man got off his tractor and wiped the sweat off his brow, and he said, "Yes, it is beautiful, but you should have seen what it looked like when God had it by himself." A well-known entrepreneur was asked the secret of her business success, and she answered, "I pray as if everything depends on God, but I act as if everything depends on me." So these things we talk about today, I want you to take them with you when you go home and walk them out the door with you and put them into action in your life. It's not just enough to pray for and to affirm something to be different. You have to treat, then move your feet. Because God can only do for you what God does through you. We're going to build on the rock. We're going to build on an expansive life of joy. We're going to build on a truth that we know that we cannot be separate from God. We're going to build on love to understand how to give it and receive it in a way that we haven't done before. We're going to build on intelligence, knowing that there's a greater mind that has all the answers, and pray, "I don't know, but I know you know." We're going to build on soul, that individualized Christ within us, and build on spirit that is eternal and pure, constant, immortal, and build on principle that knows that everything is working in a divine order that we can't understand. Let's take time for reflection and meditation.